Hey guys, in NGUI 3.5 cycle, I've added some new features to NGUI that I figure are worth making a video about, just so I can explain how they work. One of the new features I'm going to talk about is the ability to modify sprites within an existing atlas. I'm going to start by creating the wooden atlas that comes with NGUI. I'm going to assume you are familiar with this atlas by now. If not, please watch the NGUI 307 tutorial first. So here I have the NGUI sprite, and I can add it to the scene using the Alt-Shift-S shortcut, and it'll come out as exactly as you'd expect. But what if I wanted to add a shadow effect to it? I can certainly modify this sprite in Photoshop, or I can just do it directly in NGUI. To do it directly in NGUI, I can make use of this modify section right here. I can add a shadow, an outline effect, and I can also do things like add a transparent border, which will make it easier to modify it in other programs. If I wanted to create a tileable sprite, then I would add a tiled border instead. Well, let's start from the top. To add a shadow, I would specify what color I want it to be, as well as which opacity I want it to be. So for example, if I wanted a shadow that is half transparent, I would just give it an alpha of 128. And I can just add a shadow to it directly, or I can actually duplicate the sprite first. This will create a copy of the sprite, so I'm not modifying the original one. Let me actually select this duplicated sprite so you can see what's happening right away. I'm also probably going to change the camera color to be white by default so you can actually see the effect easier. So here I'm going to click the Add Shadow button. What this does is adds a single pixel of a shadow, the color of the background around the sprite. It's the same with the outline. With the outline, it adds an actual, like a glow, like a dark glow around the sprite. So I can actually click these buttons a couple of times to create a deeper effect if I want. Here, once I snap the sprite, you will actually be able to see what I created around it. So now it has a darkened shadow around it, which is what I was aiming for. Well, let's try it with a different sprite. I'm going to add something like highlight thin, for example. Slice type, and I'm going to push it back in depth. Right now you can't see it because it's a pure white sprite, and on a pure white background it's obviously not visible. But if I happen to give it a shadow effect, all of a sudden you'll be able to see it. Same thing with the outline. I can create a deeper effect if I want. Here, let me show you the same exact thing, but with a red color instead. I'm going to add a shadow first, and you can see it as a very faint outline. If I add a shadow a couple of times, you will be able to see it better. So this is the effect that is created by adding a shadow. Now let's try the same thing with the outline instead. You can see that the outline effect is actually uniform all around the sprite. These effects were not meant to replace Photoshop, but their purpose is to just give you something more to work with and allow you to quickly prototype different looking UIs while using NGUI. Of course, if you do like the modified sprite that you've created, you can always save it as a PNG and then modify it further in Photoshop or just give it to your artist. Now let's look at another common case of using NGUI. Let's create a tile texture. Here I just grabbed a wood texture from the internet, and I want to use it as my background. Now, of course, I can start by either adding it to an existing atlas or creating a new atlas instead. I'm gonna create a new atlas. I'm just gonna call it new atlas. So now that I have this new atlas, Alt-Shift-S will create the texture, and it will allow me to tile it. Now, if you're working in the game view that is always pixel perfect, it will always look great. But if you happen to be working in a game view that is not pixel perfect, for example, a game view that is using a fixed size root, then as you change the scale, you might notice lines like these going down where the seams are supposed to be. How do you fix that? It's actually quite simple. Just select the sprite, edit it, and give it a tiled border. That's it. The line is now gone. Now if you happen to be scaling your camera size or UI root size quite drastically, you will still be able to see certain lines. If that's the case, just give it a thicker border instead. Might take a couple of clicks, but there we go. The line is now gone. In case you are curious, what NGUI does is just it extends the texture on all sides so that left side will essentially be copying pixels from the right side, thus creating a tiled texture. But anyway, that's getting too technical. Another common issue you may or may not run into is if you're actually scaling the sprites upwards, like so, you will notice that the edges seem to be cropped like that. You can actually address it quite easily by modifying the sprite and giving it a transparent border. There you go. Now the lines on the sides are gone. If you then decide that you don't actually like the border, you can always just crop it and return the image back to what it used to be. Oh, and the same goes for when you have sprites bleeding through. Like here, for example, you may notice that the sprite became whitened on the bottom. The reason for that is because if you look at the actual texture for the atlas, there's this green button right here. Right below it is a pure white sprite. So when alpha is transparency is enabled, which is enabled by default, you will notice that parts of the sprite end up bleeding through. Now of course you can fix it by either not using alpha as transparency, or more commonly just leaving it on and giving the sprite a transparent border, like we did before. Just to be thorough, I've also added the ability to add a clamp border as well. What this does is it simply repeats the pixels on the border, essentially bleeding them outwards. Honestly, I have not encountered a use for this yet, but just in case you find it useful, it's there. Anyway, let's move on. Another feature that was recently added to NGUI is the ability to create bitmap fonts without using BM font or any other external software. Unfortunately, this is only for Windows users right now. Mac users will still have to resort to using Glyph Designer or something similar. To create a font, simply open the font maker. In case you forgot how to do that, you do it from NGUI, open font maker. Inside the font maker, by default it chooses the generated bitmap option, and you can actually specify which font to use. Now you cannot use the default Arial font because it's embedded. However, if you happen to have other fonts available, for example this Batman font I have, I can just choose it and specify which characters I want to be in there. So for example, if I wanted to be including only numeric characters, I would choose numeric. That's the ASCII, entire Latin collection, and of course I can type in my own. So if I, for example, had a localization file as text, I can just paste it right here, and it will automatically get rid of duplicated characters as soon as you move away. But in this case, I'm going to stick with ASCII. I can choose which atlas this font will end up in, or I can just get rid of an atlas and create a standalone font. In my case, I'm going to choose the new atlas created earlier, and I'll just hit Create Font. And there it is. Now I have a new font to work with. Let's replace this label and have it actually use the font that I just created. I'm going to get rid of the shadow effect. Instead, I'm actually going to add a shadow effect on the font itself. Now to do that, I just select the font that I created, and I have all these options right here that I can work with. Much like in the Atlas Maker, you can actually add a shadow, add an outline, and a couple of other things here. So let's do just that. I'm going to change the background of the camera to be white so you can actually see the effect better. And on the actual font, I'm going to give it a shadow. Now visually, it looks pretty much the same as if you were using this effect here with the shadow effect. But it doesn't increase the number of triangles drawn. And of course you can further modify it by making it softer, say adding an outline here, then another shadow, then another outline. You get the point. And for comparison purposes, here's the same label, except it's using a dynamic font instead of the bitmap font that I've created. As you can see, the outline is very defined. Of course, I can make it a bit more subtle, but it still doesn't have the same depth to it if you look closely. And of course, you have a much greater range of modifications on the bitmap font itself. Here's the same exact font, except with a couple of extra modifiers on it. And now I'm going to add an alpha curve to it, smoothing it out in the process. Followed by an outline again, and another outline. Anyway, I think you get the point. And just to give you a very quick example of how I can turn this font into something that looks quite a bit better, just start at the top, add a shadow, add an outline, rebalance colors, apply curve to alpha, and there you go, a font that has a bit more depth to it. Of course, now you can add another shadow, giving it quite a bit more visible depth, and maybe even another outline, and yeah, rebalance colors again if you want. Anyway, that's it. I hope you'll find this feature to be useful. Thanks for watching.